Boy. Mr. LeCompte, welcome.
Thank you very much, and I apologize for reading quickly. Secretary, Chairperson Carrion, and members of the Oversight Board, on behalf of the more than 650 faith communities and national religious institutions that Jubilee USA represents, thank you for the opportunity to address you this morning. You have received my letter, which outlines several thoughts about the governor's fiscal plan and issues around restructuring Puerto Rico's debt. What I would like to do this morning is offer some additional specific and more technical thoughts around the proposed plan and regarding the restructuring of Puerto Rico's debt. I will then close with a brief statement given to me from Monsignor Roberto Gonzalez Nieves, Archbishop of San Juan, and the General Secretary of Puerto Rico's Bible Society, Reverend Heriberto Martinez. Jubilee USA, along with the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, Catholic Charities, and the National Latino Evangelical Coalition, supported the passage of the Puerto Rico Oversight, Management, and Economic Stability Act, or PROMESA. We did this in partnership with several of the island's primary religious leaders, including the Archbishop of the Diocese of San Juan de Puerto Rico and the General Secretary of the Puerto Rico Bible Society. Further, the amendments we supported and passed the PROMESA legislation regarding child poverty reduction, austerity prevention, and support for the work of the Debt Audit Committee received unilateral support from almost all of our U.S. religious partners. This includes groups such as the United Church of Christ, to the Presbyterian Church USA, to American Jewish World Service, to Islamic Relief. The analysis of Jubilee USA comes with the experience of 20 years of debt restructuring that protects vulnerable populations and brings debt levels back to sustainability. And this is also our bias. We believe that any plans, policies, and debt restructurings must be judged in view of how they will impact vulnerable populations, social programs, and how they will reduce child poverty. We recognize that those who did nothing to create this crisis are bearing the brunt of some of the worst aspects of this crisis. I would like to offer one insight to you around PROMESA and the work of your board. Even among people of goodwill and the educated, many people still do not understand what PROMESA does do and what it doesn't do. Too many people don't understand your mandate, the powers you have, and the very particular ways that your hands are tied. This is an unfortunate reality in which we all are operating. Admittedly, one of the challenges in even getting to this moment was helping the U.S. Congress understand what bankruptcy and debt restructuring actually means. Excuse me. You still face these challenges, and I invite you, as you feel appropriate, to educate the public on these issues, your mandate, what you can do and what you can't do. This is also why it's crucial that you listen to the varied civil sectors in Puerto Rico. This is why it is essential that we listen to those who have experienced some of the worst aspects of this crisis. In my letter to you, we offered comments on austerity prevention, promoting public budget transparency, carefully considering any possible consolidations of hospitals, and our support for maintaining health care spending. I also wish to reiterate that full repayment of the public pension fund is both a legal and moral obligation. Our interpretation of PROMESA reinforces this understanding. Additionally, it's important to note that any reduction in pensions will further delay economic growth. As you study the pensions, we believe you will see that these are not Cadillac pensions, but a basic measure of support for Puerto Rico's people. Here are some of the additional thoughts we would highlight around the fiscal plan and broader budget transparency. The plan needs to seriously revenue collection. In particular, there needs to be further analysis around issues of tax evasion and tax avoidance on the island. Puerto Rico continually has failed to collect adequate tax revenue, and we are very concerned by how corporations avoid paying taxes, the wealthy find routes and shelters to avoid paying taxes. We are in agreement with several creditors that this is a serious problem on the island and that revenue streams actually exist that we are failing to capitalize on. The fiscal plan seems to focus more on streamlining agencies and does not focus enough on improving tax collection. A 2012 Government Accountability Office report the IRS could increase revenues by better targeting the island's enforcement resources. We would also, second, reiterate that plans and budgets must have healthy investments in new energy sources and renewable energy sources. Puerto Rico is rich in sun and wind, and even though investment has been promised, it has not been realized. This has significant implications for every single sector in Puerto Rican society. This is one of the most important areas for long-term sustainable economic growth. Third, we believe that while it is essential to address leakage and some areas of duplication in Puerto Rico's government, we need to protect public sector jobs as an essential job sector. Four, around public budget transparency and accountability issues, we would encourage the board to work in tandem and understand the role of the U.S. Treasury Office of Technical Assistance in Puerto Rico. We believe their role is essential in auditing, budget transparency, and revenue collection. Since Congress established their authority on the island, I am encouraged by their efforts and their progress. Please also support and learn from the multi-sector represented debt audit committee that the PROMESA legislation protects. However you move forward in this regard, the role of Puerto Rico's government and legislature is essential in the passage of public budget transparency laws for the long term. 5, the last concrete suggestion we would offer around this plan is around performance measures and benchmarks, which the plan acknowledges that it needs. The governor, board, and legislature may want to take a look at a system in the state of Maryland instituted under Governor O'Malley when he became governor. It's called STAT. I'd like to now turn to some very specific thoughts around debt restructuring. I first want to acknowledge that PROMESA requires a debt sustainability analysis to be submitted. To our knowledge, this has not taken place yet, and we believe it is absolutely essential to start reviewing these analyses as soon as possible. We are reticent to offer what haircut we need to bring the debt back to sustainable levels based on the incomplete data we have. However, we would note, again, based on the very limited we have, we believe the debt should be reduced in some range between 50 and 60%. I'd also invite the board to be innovative in any voluntary debt restructurings that they authorize. Here are just a few key considerations. Although we believe a robust debt haircut is necessary, any debt restructuring must take into account that the island of Puerto Rico is incredibly vulnerable to external shocks. Shocks include hurricanes, earthquakes, and global and regional financial crisis. In the recent debt restructuring in Grenada that Jubilee USA participated in, we saw a 50% haircut of private sector debt. While the amounts of debt in Grenada are considerably less than Puerto Rico, the debt restructuring was no less complex. And innovation to deal with external shocks in the Grenada debt restructuring, I invite you to study and review and possibly utilize. This is the hurricane clause. When certain external shocks impact Grenada, that clause creates a debt payment moratorium. Any debt restructuring in Puerto Rico should include contract clauses like this. Next, it's critical that we learn from other debt restructurings. While some overall debt restructuring is necessary and some level of parity is needed among all creditors, the board needs to review the impact of high haircuts on civil entities in Puerto Rico that own bonds. In the Greece debt restructuring, for example, some protections were put in place for these civil entities in order to not deter economic growth. While some level of debt reduction needs to take place with all creditors, we need to seriously review if civil groups should face the same level of reduction that external creditors will need to take. The last suggestion we would offer for the review of all stakeholders is the possibility of GDP-linked bonds in a debt restructuring. This pegs greater return to creditors and investors if we see greater economic growth in Puerto Rico. This deters the type of predatory behavior that we are all concerned about. This also establishes that we are all in this together, and a successful Puerto Rico means success for everyone. Success for investors, for Puerto Rico's people, and most assuredly for Puerto Rico's children. While the use of these instruments has been limited and novel, studies by financial institutions and investors should be reviewed, as we believe Puerto Rico could be an ideal candidate for this type of instrument. My final comment before reading the brief closing statement from the Archbishop and General Secretary is that we must act very quickly to restructure Puerto Rico's debt. The debt payment moratorium clock is ticking. If authorized voluntary restructurings fail, you must authorize the court-facilitated bankruptcy process. In closing, and I'll slow down just a little bit for their brief statement, since it's an important part of my comments, I have a statement to read from Monsignor Roberto Gonzalez Nieves, Archbishop of San Juan de Puerto Rico, and Reverend Heriberto Martinez, General Secretary of Puerto Rico Bible Society, and they write to you. We are pleased you are meeting in Puerto Rico. We encourage you to meet Puerto Rico's people and talk to ordinary workers, families, and the poor. It is important that you learn from them and learn how the crisis impacts them. Our people are suffering. Nearly 60% of kids on our island live in poverty. In your important work in addressing the island's financial and evolving humanitarian crisis, we pray you will weigh any decision that you make in light of how it impacts our children and the children of future generations. This crisis was not of their making, yet they are inheriting this crisis. We pray that in the years to come, this crisis will be solved in ways that protect the vulnerable and lift our children. We pray that this crisis will be solved in ways that lift our people who are trapped in poverty and who wish to overcome dependency, but can only do so step by step. Our homeland, this island, Nuestra Patria, Puerto Rico, is sacred ground for us and our people. While you are here, we invite you to learn about this sacred land and sow hope in the hearts of the people of this land, our people who wish for a more dignified future. May the Lord bless you with wisdom. Thank you again for the opportunity to address you today.
Amen. Thank you, Mr. LeCompte.
I'll just offer three thoughts since I covered much of this in my testimony. We very much agree that public budget transparency is essential. We need real data. We need real numbers. We need to understand the issues. We do believe that a robust haircut of the debt is absolutely necessary, but we would like to see instruments and mechanisms like GDP-linked bonds, which we believe really creates economic incentive for everyone to be on the same page. And then I think finally, the revenue question is a very important question. We agree with many of the creditors that we've been meeting with that there is a greater revenue stream that's not being utilized just on tax enforcement, let alone the reality that taxes for the very wealthy and for corporations, big corporations, can be targeted in ways that we've been failing to do so in Puerto Rico.
Thank you. I mean, under the fiscal plan, which assumes an infusion of federal, I think some pretty generous assumptions regarding economic growth. I think debt service is cut by about 50%. If you don't assume federal money, and if you'd use what I think are probably more realistic economic assumptions, they may get nothing. Is it your view that that could occur, but that in the future, bond markets would continue to be willing to lend to the Puerto Rican government after the previous bondholders have been wiped out?
Well, I mean, of course. I mean, we've seen in continued debt restructurings all over the globe that not only are lenders willing to continue to lend, that they even are often in cases when a default has taken place. So is it perfect? I mean, do we understand, some of the risks and what it might mean in the short term? Certainly, but the reality of it is that lenders still want to lend.
Let me ask about that, because when we talk about the rest of the world and we talk about sovereign debt, you're usually talking about institutional lenders, both private and multilateral, supranational lenders. The problem seems to me, Mr. LeCompte, and I'd like you to realize that where Puerto Rico is part of the U.S. municipal market, and that market is fundamentally either directly or indirectly through mutual funds, a retail market. It's a domestic market. Domestic two ways for Puerto Rico. Domestic in the sense of local bondholders, and domestic in the sense of hundreds of thousands of bondholders in the U.S. It is not an institutional market where people are accustomed to taking losses and recapitalizing enterprises and moving forward. In fact, there's a very low history of defaults and losses. So my question is, this would be a rather unprecedented loss that you are suggesting and proposing. Do you have any specific basis on which to assume that that market would remain accessible to the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, its issuers? It is not the IMF, it is not institutional in nature, it is domestic and it is.
Sure. Well, let me point out, I think the challenge with the Grenada debt restructuring, which we now have seen lending continue, is that the public sector, the IMF, the Caribbean Development Bank, which Puerto Rico doesn't have to worry about.
Does not have access to.
Yeah, which is great, because those were the ones that refused to restructure the debt in Grenada. But it was a very responsible creditors committee, some who also hold debt in Puerto Rico, that restructured the debt by 50%. And in doing so, when we achieved that debt restructuring, we actually make a market more ripe for future investing.
That you're talking about institutional lenders again, who probably entered the market at a discount, the way you describe it. I don't know the case of Grenada, but the issue for future market access is the future market access for Puerto Rico, as distinct from the current holders, who for, I don't know, 20% may be institutional in nature. The future market, if you are to have access to finance infrastructure long-term at the rates at which infrastructure needs to be financed to be cost-effective for the development of Puerto Rico, that is the municipal market. And that, again, is not the market you're referring to. Grenada, or put another way, I would somewhat question the applicability of the Grenada case to Puerto Rico. But, I understand what you're saying about some institutional private holders who are opportunistic being very willing and able to take significant haircuts because they probably had a point of entry that was significantly lower than a par. But once again, I would caution rushing into that analysis on the basis of a completely different market with different investors.
Right. I mean, I agree that there are differences, but I think there are also some similarities. But I think that's also why we are encouraging for all voluntary debt restructurings, which has to happen. We have to have a robust debt haircut, but that we look at innovative instruments, both because Puerto Rico is technically a possession, a part of the United States, and we believe there are advantages in that particular case. But I think also this type of innovation creates more buy-in from some of the different institutions that you're speaking about.